Our guest on the CTQ Smartcast today is the answer to what connects fish, Sri Lanka, and the eminent scientist JBS Halliday. Samanth Subramanian, welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Samanth, let's rewind the clock a little bit. Is there an origin story to when you decided that you wanted to get into writing, be a journalist?
There isn't actually. I think at the end of my school years, the only thing I knew was that I didn't want to be an engineer. And I was fortunate enough at that time to have gotten a scholarship to study an undergraduate degree in the US. And when I had applied, I had to put down some kind of major or specialization. I had to pick something with the assumption that it was always possible to change it a year or 2 years into the course. That's how the US system works. And so I put down journalism almost as a kind of fluke. It seemed like something that would be interesting to study because I liked reading. I enjoyed writing, and I was quite sort of addicted to the news in the late 90s. And so I put that down and I went and took a few courses and enjoyed it enough to stick with it. So there was no sort of big hinge or inflection point where I decided to become a journalist or a writer. It was the constraints of the application form to this one particular university that led me in there.
All right. So, also looking back, I've been fortunate to follow you first through your blogging and, of course, through the quizzing circuit as well. So you've often taken the scenic route to, you've kind of written about cinema, you've written about sports, cricket in particular, and today you're writing about things like the future of capitalism. So describe the scenic route to me. What was it? This is a common kind of a reaction for a lot of generalists, I guess, and specialists perhaps, that if you were to look at a very crude divide that way, the generalists tend to kind of meander for a bit, kind of drink in different pools before settling in, and then they never ever truly settled in. So how did those years go?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You are right that in the sense that this might be a reaction for a lot of specialists looking at generalists, but I think it's also the reaction of a lot of people who are maybe not accustomed to seeing journalism from the inside out. I think journalism, by and large, is a field that where this kind of generalism is not. It may not be common, and it may not be universal, but it is certainly common enough that nobody remarks upon it. So it is quite regular in journalism, I think, that you start off covering one thing and then move to another thing and then eventually end up somewhere else. And of course, with my own tastes and preferences also, it led me to this kind of generalist approach because I find myself interested in a lot of different things. My quizzing, which you mentioned, is also an offshoot of that in one sense. And I feel too much as if, in my mind at least, that it would be too much to be tied down to one subject for the rest of my life. So, and there are sacrifices here. Obviously, you sacrifice the kind of depth that you could get if you stick to one thing for 20 years. I started off as a cricket journalist in 2001. If I had been a cricket journalist 20 years later, maybe I would have acquired a huge level of depth to it. But my interest was more in the writing aspect of it. And by that, what I mean is the form of journalism or the operation, the process of journalism. And let me explain that a little bit, in the sense that I like the putting together of facts and stories and anecdotes and research, the assembling of that. And then I like the transformation of that into a piece of prose or a piece of text, the actual process of writing it. And as long as these two components of the job are available to me, in a sense, I don't even mind what I write about. I have to be interested in the subject, and then I have to be able to write about it in a way that makes it interesting to me and to others. And so my entire operational principle of journalism, if you will, is the fact that if you have these two moving parts, you can apply them to any subject, any topic. And increasingly, as you know also, that I've been moving over the last 10 years in particular, moving more and more towards longer pieces. And again, it's that operational principle put to its even more extreme limit, which is if you give me enough time, I will research and write a piece that is fresh and new and interesting on virtually any subject. I say virtually, I mean, there are many things that I don't know and so on, but as long as it's a story where I can go out and interview people and do my research and sit in a library or read books or read old archives and talk to other people on background and so on, I can eventually put some sort of a story or a narrative together that is interesting to read. So this is all I'm following. I just sort of follow my nose on narrative and not so much on topic.
Right. And what got you interested in the narrative style of nonfiction? I know actually at one point I remember you blogging about things like the New Yorker. I remember that you're talking about getting that DVD collection that they had put all their archives on. It was a very vivid post for me because I think you kind of raved about it for a while. So, and it left me very jealous. I should also plunge a few of my savings then. I regret that I didn't. So, where did that yen for this style come through?
It's a combination of things. If you grew up like you and me did, essentially enjoying reading of every kind, but reading, what you might call good books in the sense well plotted and character driven and things like that. There is only one form of journalism that provides something similar, which is this long form, this narrative thing. It's the only genre of journalism that operates in scenes and has characters. One of my editors likes to say it's the only kind of journalism in which you can see the passage of time over the course of a story. There is a narrative arc. And so you can almost, and in the best kind of journalism like this, you can almost forget for a minute that you are actually reading journalism. You can get sucked into the story and treat it as if it was fiction. And yet, of course, there is this amazing underpinning of fact. Again, you and I both find the world utterly fascinating. This is the reason we quiz after all, because I think there's so much to discover, so many oddities and byways of knowledge that we love. And the fact that the world is fascinating by itself made me want to try to convey some of that fascination to people who read magazines and newspapers. And so if you want to do that satisfyingly, or most satisfyingly, I think one of the best ways to do it is this kind of narrative journalism, where you can discover something unknown or discover some depth in a hitherto superficial story, or and then be able to translate that in a really in a narrative sense, in this kind of storytelling sense that is classic storytelling, where you start with, once upon a time this happened, and then this happened, and this is where the whole thing ended up, and this is what you didn't know about it. I often teach in some of my writing workshops and classes. I often tell there's all these arguments about structure, where do you start a story and things like that. And we talk about that a lot. And one of the things I like to tell students and to discuss with them is this, what helps me very often is to forget that I'm writing a piece for a magazine. If I'm struggling with where I should begin a story, I think about where I would begin telling this story to a friend if we were in a bar having a drink. What is the first thing, the most immediate thing that you would tell him or her to get them interested in this? And then it goes from there. So I say this as a kind of shorthand to figure out structure, but actually there's something more profound in it, in the sense that this is really an extension of that kind of casual storytelling, where you want to get people interested and hooked, and you want to tell them a story, and you want to leave them with a better appreciation or a sense of the world that they live in.
And in some sense, that there is something timeless about it, which is why people have done it before, and people will probably continue to explore these kinds of stories. So therefore, over the years, have you now evolved a style of your own? If I were to look for a signature Saman piece, what would I expect to see in that marks you out, or is this kind of too facetious or egoistic a question to ask you?
I don't think so. I mean, there are multiple things here, and it all has to do with writing jargon, none of which anybody is able to define successfully at all. So, there writers talk about things called voice. Right. That writing has voice, prose has voice, and voice is distinctive. Every writer has it. It is very hard to pin down what that is. And so I'm not going to try. I don't know what my voice would consist of, except that, I hope that if people read something by me, they would recognize it as something by me. But it doesn't just have to do with the words that you use. It has to do, maybe, as you said, with sort of the range or the catholicity of writing. Maybe it has to do with the form it takes. If it's a longer piece, then maybe it's more likely to belong to a long-form journalist such as myself. You can sort of pick things up like that. But I've definitely, so voice is one thing. Style is something else altogether, related but distinct. That has to do more with structure and so on. And I would like to think that the stories I do best and that I enjoy doing the most are the ones where you see a lot of some of this that we talked about, which is a lot of character and a richness of description, a feeling of being plunged into things as they are happening, maybe dialogue between people where I am just an observer, hopefully kind of an occasional wry sense of humor. And some attention being paid to the different levels at which a story operates, so that even if I'm telling you a superficial narrative about a spat between members at a club in Bombay, what I'm actually telling you is 2 or 3 layers of stories below that about the way in which the wealthy interact with each other in Bombay, about the way in which India lives with its colonial past, about the way in which India relates to land issues. Some of these are explicitly stated, some of them are less explicitly stated, but the themes are all there. So all of these moving parts are there to varying extents in varying pieces of writing that I do. And definitely, of course, when I write books, they're all there. So maybe all of them together constitute some kind of style, although, of course, many other writers use these moving parts also, and in different ways and much more creatively than I do.
Right. So allied to that is a question on the house style of different platforms. Right now, over the years, there are a lot of these platforms. You can you can take a Salon, or you can take a Guardian, you can take a New Yorker. All said and done, everyone has a sort of internal house style, and I'm sure there is some give and take between the writer and the editorial kind of nudges that you get. So, and this is something that we observe only as outsiders. We are not privy to what happens inside. So, can you shed a little light on how these different platforms, they share a lot in common? They have a lot of these pieces are in this narrative style, leaving aside the more immediate kind of news reporting that also comes on that side. Do you see a convergence of this style which makes it easier for writers like you to write for multiple publications, or do you have to adapt? And so tell me a little bit about
that. The most interesting thing I can tell you perhaps is the fact that there are geographical variations that are quite intriguing. I think like the UK, for example, magazines in the UK are usually much more forgiving of, even encouraging of your own style. Okay. You can take more liberties with the prose. You can be a little riskier. You can be a little more distinctive. And, unless it's egregious, they will not edit it down. They will not pare back the style. American publications are much more rigid. The house style, sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference in house style between one publication and another. There are minor variations. The New Yorker is the most famous example of a magazine with a very rigid voice and a house style that you will recognize from 1,000 meters away. Some magazines, again, as I said, are a little bit more forgiving of that. So it depends. But I think house style varies even more interestingly by the kind of piece that you're doing. And I think that's where you have to kind of figure out how you suit your tone. If you're doing a long reported feature on, let's say this was March 2020. I'm thinking back just to pieces I was doing. So March 2020 or April 2020, when I was writing about the initial developments on vaccines across the world. This is a very scientific, quite a technical piece because you have to explain how DNA vaccines and RNA vaccines work, what the science is like, what the stakes are, who is working on it, and how, what is the kind of work that is being done on it. In that kind of a piece, you would be less forgiving of style in a writer. You would want them to be, the premium is on clarity and concision, and sort of an elegance of prose that makes it as easy as possible to understand something. If I change that around to another piece that I did, which is about these two brothers who were part of the plan to attack churches during Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka, churches and hotels. Now, over there, there is, this is not a technical story. What it is a human story. The intriguing part here is the psychological aspect of it, the biographical aspect of it. And so over there, the writer is immersed in the story a little more. You are able to sort of show your own mind and your own thinking, and you are able to show, and you're able to use sort of there's a certain latitude in the language that you can use to make it more vivid to people who are living, who've never been to Colombo, but also who don't know these lives at all. And so, I think the decisions and these judgments about style and voice have to be made on depending on what the subject is rather than on what the publication is. I think that's again, if it's a reported piece, you are usually more sort of clarity, explanation, that kind of thing. If it is an opinion piece, if it is a column or a film review or a book review, again, there is so much more importance placed on what you think, you as the writer, that also shows in the prose itself. The prose can be a little bit more stylized, more unique or personal or distinctive. But it becomes quite easy beyond a point to navigate these changes. I think it becomes almost on autopilot. The trick is actually to be able to try to do unexpected things with it. So the truly skilled writers would be able to take a vaccine piece and somehow be stylized with it or be unique with it in a way that doesn't interfere with the explanation, but is still somehow subverting this expectation that these pieces will just be clear above all else, that there will be some element of style there. So, and that's something that is always sort of interesting to experiment with.
If you can, would you name a couple of these people who consistently surprise?
There's a New Yorker writer called Nick Baumgarten, who some people may have read. I think he's sort of a classic example of this. He wrote a piece, I remember quite early in the pandemic, about how people were responding and how the wealthy were responding, in particular in terms of moving money around and things like that. Again, sounds like it would be quite a cut and dried piece in the sense that he would just talk to these people, but it turned out to be actually a very stylized piece of reporting. I think he did another piece so he's been doing pieces through this pandemic that I've been looking at as examples of this kind of writing, where you expect it to be something quite straightforward and concise, but because Nick Baumgarten is Nick Baumgarten, he can never let go of his voice. I think whatever he's writing about, he will continue to write it in just a stylized and unique and distinctive way that we know and love. And so he's a good example.
Great. In fact, one of the things I was curious about was now with so many people have tools of content production are democratized in a sense. So everyone out there is potentially a writer with an interesting thought. How do you kind of navigate this, getting an interesting angle when it's a million monkeys out there, so finding an interesting, unusual angle to something that everyone is talking about. Does that cross your mind, or does the distinctiveness play a part in the stories that you choose to tell, or do you just trust the fact that whatever angle you have, the way you will talk about it, what research you do around it, will shoulder the burden of making it distinctive and strong in its own sense? So do you kind of worry about what everyone else is going to be talking about?
No, I don't find myself worrying about that. In part because an angle is just the beginning. An angle is a take. It's very easy for people to have angles and takes online. But that's not journalism, and that's not what I do in any case. So, everything that I do, all journalism is predicated on research and reporting. And so, as long as these people with angles are not going out there and spending 2 months interviewing people and trying to understand something, what I do is very different from what they do. Now, having said that, it is you're right that there's a lot of noise, but somebody like me has to treat that as an asset, in the sense that people are talking about this. There are ways for me to spot entries into stories that they have not thought of, and so that is one advantage. There are a couple of, among these people who have takes, obviously there are, the quote unquote million monkeys who you refer to, but there are also a few dozen people who know what they're talking about because they're inside this particular industry. So that is an advantage to me because it leads me to sources. I find very often people online who are on Twitter and just kind of talking about a subject with a lot of knowledge because they are inside the industry, inside that sphere. And I will write to them and say, listen, I'd like to talk to you about this. Some of these people run newsletters, and I subscribe to their newsletters on a range of topics, some of which I will never write about. But just in the off chance that there is a story idea in there somewhere, and this guy has explained it in an interesting way in a particular issue of the newsletter, I might be able to pick up on it. But I don't ever have to worry that these dozen people talking about something with some knowledge and depth will cannibalize the journalism I plan to do about it, because they are also drowning in the noise. They are also not writers, they are not storytellers, they are doing what they do best, which is they are knowledgeable about their own field. And so there is always, and there always will be, I think, a function, a role for somebody like me to go from the general audience into the specific world, try to absorb some of this knowledge and bring it back to the general audience. So it doesn't worry me in any way.
Okay. In fact, I was going to ask you how you would probably define what you do these days, but I think you just answered my question. So I actually want to then ask, when you started your career, it was, we didn't have things like Twitter. The internet was kind of, when you look back, it sounds so much more innocent and naive than perhaps it is today. And in some sense, I also look at it, there's a small parallel with what we used to do with our quizzing as well, because prior to that era, the school style quizzing, which was all very factual and things that you could get out of an encyclopedia was, drove that kind of quizzing. And once the internet came, we got into if I can call it medium form, and maybe occasionally long form PowerPoint slides of questions, because suddenly people could do research, people could find and dig out more interesting stories, and you didn't have to have 30 years of experience in that following that topic. So if you can cast your eye a little bit on what have been the major shifts in terms of practicing the kind of journalism that you do in the last couple of decades, now with things like Twitter, with so many things at your disposal. What has shifted? If you can take two things. One is what has changed in the kinds of stories you choose to tell now. What has changed in the process of maybe we'll dig into some of these a little more. So let's start with the input side. Like, what has changed broadly if you look back?
Well, the kinds of stories that you choose to tell. Okay, let's start there. So I think 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because the internet was more rudimentary, and arguably so there was a diminished sense compared to now, at least, of other parts of the world, even sometimes other parts of a country, right? And so correspondingly, the kind of stories you could tell from, say, if you are a writer in one part of the world and you're writing for another part of the world, the kinds of stories you could tell would also be much more basic. If you were a magazine writer in India in 1995 wanting to write for the New Yorker, you would tell a very particular kind of story, which is overly broad and generic and possibly sort of stereotyped. And the appetite for those stories would be small. So once you've written one story like that, that's pretty much it for the next 2 years. And I think obviously now, because the internet has expanded the sense of people's knowledge of other parts of the world, and expanded their sense of why other parts of the world are important, what it is, why it's important to know about them. You can be much more nuanced in the stories that you tell. And so, it doesn't really have to be a profile of a prime minister when he's elected, and then that's it for the next 5 years. There are many more things you can do. So the inputs have grown, as the inputs, as we call them, and the kinds of stories that you can do, that has expanded. The process has changed in some ways, most notably, actually, not because of Twitter or anything, but because I realized over the last year in particular, obviously communication is enhanced so much by what you can do online that it is sometimes easy to fool yourself that you can perpetually do journalism like this. You can just perpetually sit at your computer on Zoom and talk to people, and that should be enough to do a long form journalism. And research is easier. I can download books. I can look at old magazines and newspaper archives. I can look at journal articles. There is so much out there that it is possible to school yourself or educate yourself in a topic entirely online, and then write a fairly good piece out of it. But I say that it has only changed in some ways, is that it still doesn't feel to me like internet-driven journalism is anywhere near as rich as offline journalism. I think the whole point of being a journalist, one of the points for me, was to be able to go to interesting places and meet interesting people in person, and be able to describe what that is like. And so many times on assignments, I have caught myself in the middle of something. I've just literally reminded myself, saying, look at where you are. I'm so lucky to be here. I'll be, below the sea floor in Singapore, in a place where they store oil, or I will be in a boxing ring in Hong Kong where bankers are hitting each other. All of these places that I've been to purely because of journalism, and I want to convey some of that back to my readers. And that is impossible, obviously, if you're just sitting at home doing Zoom. So the access to information has grown, the access to people has grown. It's much easier to find, track down somebody if you want to, with all the tools of the internet at your disposal. But ultimately, the core process, which is the conversations with people, the absorbing of surroundings, and then the writing, and then the synthesis of that into a piece, it remains exactly the same. And I think that is why it remains such a powerful thing to do, because there's so much durability in that process and so much value in it that it won't change in a hurry. And I don't think Zoom or the pandemic or any of that have transformed that.
So once we had armchair journalists, now we have journalists within I think a single room. But I hope you will get to go out more often pretty soon.
It's funny. I'm going out today for an interview for the first time in months. Wow. In 7 months. Of course, it's London. We're meeting in a park, socially distanced, all of this stuff. It's not like I'm seeing anything interesting, because I can't yet go to offices or to places of work, but it's a start, and we'll see how that goes.
in some sense, that is a story in itself, right? The stepping out is a
Exactly.
momentous occasion for a lot of us right now. I just want to shift attention away from the craft to the business side of journalism, because that has, has had a lot come at it in the last couple of decades as well. So, as someone who's, on the creative end, who's kind of, writing these stories, how much does a shift in business models, or the fact that some people are measuring success because they can finally measure something tangible, and it may just be a vanity metric in some cases. So how has that changed the way journalists operate, behave these days?
And you hear a lot of stories. I should say that until January this year, I have not actually been in a newsroom as part of a physical office for 10 years. I was mostly a freelancer. It's only in January that I joined a newsroom, although even now I'm remote. But so as a result of that, sometimes I've been immune to the changes over the last decade in particular. And because I write magazine stories, again, there is a different kind of metric that is usually applied to these stories. Nobody kind of judges you on the number of hits a piece gets. Nobody sort of hikes your pay up and down, so on. But you hear some of these horror stories from within the industry that traffic matters, and journalists are judged by that. Definitely, from the business side, the thing that has hurt most is obviously the huge decline in advertising in print media, and the consequent sort of dwindling circulation. I mean, advertising and subscriber numbers were what news organizations used to fund journalism. The process is expensive. It's time consuming. The longer you report, the more expensive it becomes if you want to do in-depth investigations, if you want to do a piece that involves travel, if you want to do a piece that involves rigorous fact-checking where you employ fact-checkers and maybe lawyers to go over a piece to make sure it's watertight. All of this costs money. And if you don't have the money to pay for it, you obviously can't do as much of it as you would like. And so for a long time, starting from, I don't know, about 2005 to 2000, I would say about 11, 12, 13, there was a genuine, there was a very alarming decline in the funds that were available for this. In parallel, there was also the rise of a different kind of journalistic enterprise, which was almost all online, which was entirely comment-driven, which would look at the shoe leather journalism that a mainstream newspaper or magazine did, and then kind of ride off that by commenting on it and trying to do so for traffic. So that emerged on the side, and while it employed a lot of people, and net is probably good for the journalism industry as a whole, it was impossible for people like me to feel that it was entirely a good thing, because there's only so much opinion you can take. What you really need is the facts. So things look quite precarious, but I think like somehow the industry has been able to keep, particularly in the US, has been able to keep going. In some publications, subscriber numbers have improved. The flip side of that has been a disastrous hollowing out of local news, which is really the lifeblood of journalism everywhere. We see this in India also. Big newspapers are consolidating, but smaller newspapers, I think, don't have business models anymore to run on, and it will only get worse as advertising in print declines there also. We see again in India the huge emergence of opinion journalism almost as a genre by itself. Sometimes again, disastrous effect when you look at some of the sites that are around today. And so the change in business model has, I think, at least for a while, genuinely imperiled reported journalism. It imperiled time, journalism that required time and energy and resources. And I think while it's not quite as precarious now as it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, there is still a sense, and particularly again with this pandemic, there is still a sense that it could all vanish overnight. And so everybody, all these magazines sort of had a tough year last year. And it's very much, your livelihood. If I was a freelancer still today, as I was last year, your livelihood would very much be tied to the fortunes of the larger economy and the larger kind of market for journalism out there.
Samanth, I have a bunch of questions based on what we just discussed, but I have you here and I can't resist asking a couple of quiz questions for you. So I hope you're up for it. You did not know this was coming. So
yeah, I did not. It's totally unscripted.
Great. So my first question is, all these questions have a sort of connection to you. So my first
So I better
question,
get them right, no?
So my question is about Japanese children. Okay, so Japanese children liked collecting these, especially during the summer. And over time, since more families moved to cities, this hobby of collection became a little difficult. There was a lot of friction in it. So a company called the Mirai Psycho company near Tokyo in 1999 installed a vending machine, the first of its kind, to vend these items. So children could just walk up to a machine, pay 400 yen and get a pair each. So what were these children collecting? And I'll give you a hint in 5 seconds. So your hint is Haldane.
Good God. Beetles?
Oh, wonderful. Well done. So they used to collect beetles, bugs, insects of all kinds. And
wow. Okay.
Apparently they had these summer trips to the forest and so on, which became
amazing,
tougher with urbanization. So
amazing.
Cool. Yeah, so I always trust you to pull that one out of the hat, if not the vending machine. Cool. So I actually, before we go ahead, because you spend so much time on the book, a dominant character, congratulations, by the way, on it. It's a fine piece of writing. I've also want to ask you that because Haldane was also known for his ability to communicate science. Some of our listeners are people who are looking for ways in which they communicate, what they do to the to people around them. Can you kind of give us a sense of some of the things that you learned from this exercise of delving into his life that some of these listeners can apply? It's more in the give us a few tips on how to do communication around seemingly abstruse topics.
Yeah, absolutely. For a long time in writing courses, there was one standard, there continues to be one standard essay that is assigned about how to write clearly. This essay is Politics in the English Language by George Orwell. Yeah. And Orwell's essay is problematic in various ways, but it has sort of some nuggets of truth in it, which is sort of don't use jargon, don't use long words, try not to be opaque, that kind of thing. But I firmly believe the essay that should replace it is JBS Haldane's own essay, How to Write a Scientific Article. I think it's a much better piece. He does not talk down as much to his readers. And I think he gets at really key concepts of communication in it. So, for example, he says, some of the advice he shares is common to Orwell as well, which is don't use long words, don't use fancy sentences, complicated sentences, try to be simple. This is all very easy. One of the things he says is try to relate, if you're writing about science, try to relate the science with something that your readers will know in their daily lives, and move up from there in steps. So, for example, if you want to describe the explosion of a bomb, maybe you start off by talking about how a kettle goes off under pressure on your gas, and then you kind of move from there to the larger explosion or the larger kind of explosion, I guess is the right word. He would often pick his anecdotes and stories from the newspaper headlines. So, for example, when he wanted to write about how hormones work, he picked on some kind of scandalous tabloid story about how some English football club was using monkey glands to enhance their performance, and then he would go from there. He warned writers to not think their readers to be daft, which I think is very important. Don't ever underestimate your reader. It's not that your reader doesn't know or want to know. It's just that they need to have things explained to them in a particular way to best know what you want to communicate. And he was, his essays, and this is not something he ever said out loud, but this is something I've kind of gleaned from reading a lot of his popular scientific articles, is that his essays obviously had to simplify because that is just the nature of a piece that runs in a newspaper or a magazine about science. But it never oversimplifies, in the sense it never went to the point where you are essentially giving the reader a misleading image of how the world works or how nature works. And finally, he would range all over the map. So science communication for him was not just his own field, which is genetics and maybe a little bit of biochemistry, but it would be cosmology and it would be chemistry and physics and all of these other things. And he would, keep up to date on new discoveries across all of these fields and somehow be able to communicate all of them to his readers. And he would be excited about them. And I think this was the other interesting thing. You could see in his writing the fact that he himself was excited and stimulated by some of these things he was talking about, and some of the research that was being done out there that he was distilling for the reader. And I think communicating that is a huge asset for any writer or any science communicator, because you want your readers similarly to feel excited and stimulated by that.
Yeah, so incidentally, I choose to think we have something called as a daily reader compound, wherein people we kind of, it's like assigned reading but more fun. We have a group of people. We give them one article, non-fiction article, about 15 minutes worth of reading in a day. We curate that and so on. And one of the ever popular pieces across these different cohorts has been Haldane's On Being the Right Size.
Yep.
It's a simple PDF, no trappings of any kind, but people just love it. And in fact, your pieces have also made the cut, by the way, Saman. Don't worry about that. We've got a few of your long and short pieces.
I'm very glad.
There is one, I think, about toilet rolls, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
That's a big popular. That's one for Sundays, because that's a long piece, relatively speaking. So I actually wanted to ask you about this. So we've arrived at the kind of 15-minute mark, the 3,000 odd word kind of a threshold for something that a lot of busy people can consume in a day. And so when you've made the shift from more simpler, smaller pieces to long reads, what has been the biggest shift in your mindset? Is it that I'm sure it's not simply I can put more information. I'm sure it just gives you a larger canvas. So what does that larger canvas allow you to do?
Well, the canvas allows you to do a lot. I mean, it allows you to be, we talked about some of this. It allows you to be more vivid, more descriptive. You can occasionally meander with some kind of self-discipline, as long as you come back to your topic. You can do interesting things with form, just with how the piece looks on the page, how it functions on the page. You can do interesting things with structure. But equally important is what the form does not allow you to do. If I have put 5,000 words down on a page, and the reader knows that when they begin the piece, this is going to be a long piece, there is even more pressure on the writer to not let the reader go from paragraph one. If it is a 500-word short piece, you can somehow assume that the reader may read it through because it's not a lot of time. And maybe once they've, like Magnuson, once they've started, they will just finish. You cannot assume that for a long read at all. You have to make sure that every paragraph is compact and worth having and leads in an intriguing way to the next paragraph, and then maybe to the next section, and that you are drawing conclusions for the reader or guiding them towards conclusions or giving them information that they didn't have. So the pressures or the demands of it are just as high as the kind of, they're just as intense as the liberation that it affords you when you sit down to write 5,000 words.
So from there, I want to segue into how you get better as a writer, because this kind of a shift, right, you just spoke about, uh, does that happen purely, through a, you get commissioned to do something, or you pitch something, you start working on it, and the process, because you have a group of people to help you. It's not a writer is not a single person chugging away. It's a team of people to put together that product. So I'm actually curious to know, how is it that someone like you gets better at their craft? So do you approach writing as deliberate practice, or do you have practices around, I will write 1,000 words outside of what I'm supposed to do? Or is writing so all consuming that you would rather watch Netflix instead? So tell me a little bit about the practice, the getting better side of writing for yourself.
I do know one friend who actually writes a page a day in a notebook outside of his own journalism. It is not journalistic writing, it is just writing. And he just does it for himself to kind of see the sentences form and so on. It's very good practice. And I wish I could do it, but I can't. I mean, I think I write on a day-to-day basis. I've been doing this for 20 years now. Every day, almost every day, I have been writing. I write on weekends. There will be something I have to finish or something I have to edit. When I'm working on a book, it's 7 days a week. And so there's so much of that to do that I think it forms its own practice. I mean, it's the equivalent of like, would a batsman even need net practice if he's playing a game every day? I don't think so. So that is it's the only way. It's the only way to get better, is to just keep doing it. But a lot of these other things help. So, for example, having editorial feedback on your pieces helps a lot. Having somebody else from outside your own mind look at the piece through 3 or 4 or 5 drafts, immensely helpful. I mean, and then the things you learn from that and apply to the next piece, it's invaluable. I think there's a lot of, I think I like to do a lot of what I call targeted careful reading, which is if I read a piece by someone that I admire a lot, I tend to go back to those pieces again and again and kind of read them multiple times, and sometimes even sketch out for myself the reasons they work, why I like them, how I would break them up structurally, what this section is doing, why these words have been chosen, why this tone has been taken. All of these things I will kind of go back to these pieces to do again and again. Some of these pieces I've revisited 20, 25 times. And that helps a lot, because it then gives you things that you can apply in your own writing later. They're like lessons that you can.
Does any one of them come to mind, just as an example?
Yeah. I mean, the one that comes to mind above all else every time is the profile of Shivnara and Chandrapal by Rahul Bhattacharya. Again and again, many times over. I've read this enough times that it will embarrass him if I tell him about it. But it's one of those things where like I go to such pieces just to kind of remind myself of how a piece can really flow, and what writing can do, the effect it can achieve. There's a lot of other things, little tricks that I have. If I'm writing a piece in a particular genre, or if I'm writing a book in a particular genre, I will tend to keep reading other books in other genres, but that remind me of the tone that I need in my own writing. So it's not necessarily that if I'm writing a book about a civil war, I will read another book about a civil war. It may be something else entirely, but somehow the voice and tone in that remind me of the voice and tone I have to take, or I want to take in my own writing. And so I will it'll sit next to my laptop as I'm writing for the entire duration of a project, and I will keep dipping into it. Sometimes it's like looking at one paragraph and refreshing my mind helps. But these are all trivial tricks that I've kind of worked out for myself. I mean, the main thing about writing is just that you just have to write. And I think it's the same with everything. Classical music, sports, art. I mean, you just have to keep doing it. And you have to be attentive to the ways that you do it also, I think. If you keep doing it without sort of paying attention to what you're doing and why you're doing it, the mistakes that you make, the habits that you have formed and want to break, your particular distinctive assets as a writer, but also your particular distinctive weaknesses as a writer. I mean, if you don't keep paying attention to this, you'll just never progress. So You have to kind of write, and then you have to stand over your own shoulder as you write and look at what you write and kind of analyze it.
So do you hate reading your own written articles, or you kind of go back, go away for a while and come back and read it, or you're very comfortable with making that or getting that distance very quickly?
It's an interesting question. Once something is published in the immediate aftermath, I don't read it because invariably I've moved on to something else, or I'm sick of that, or whatever, and I don't go back to it. If I do go back to something, it'll probably be years down the line. And at that point, I'll go back, and it will feel as if I have not written it. I mean, it's kind of, and maybe this is a consequence of the volume of writing you do as a full-time writer, as a journalist. Or maybe it's just a consequence of the way my mind works. But I will be able to look at it quite dispassionately, and maybe I will remember why I did something here or why I did something there. But by and large, it will feel almost like a very alien, unfamiliar piece of work. It's a very strange feeling to have.
Okay, so before we go ahead and keep talking about the creative side of things, one more question. Okay.
Sure.
So, because we're talking about fish and tamrams, I have to ask a question about Michael Madana Kamarajan. So let me do that.
Okay.
So, according to Kamal Hassan, which 1895 comedy subtitled "A Trivial Comedy for Serious People" is one of the inspirations behind the tone and tenor of the film?
By comedy, you mean a book, is it? 1895?
No, I'm being deliberately ambiguous.
You are obfuscating. Okay, wait, let me think. 1895, a trivial comedy for serious people.
This is a very sincere question.
Yeah. And there's a fish connect, you said?
No, the fish connection is only for the film, the choice of the film.
That's I see. Okay.
Leave that aside. I didn't mean to include that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm going to blank on this one.
Okay, 1895 comedic play.
Let me say The Importance of Being Honest.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Good, well done. I did not know this is what he says, but we'll take everything with a little pinch of salt. But of course, the gold rush ending is perhaps something that is more.
Yes, of course. Yeah, the house falling over the hill.
Falling off.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a little bit about this. We spoke about being a freelancer. We spoke about the whole media economy kind of changing. So, is there now some pressure to monetize your audience? Be the CEO of Samanth Inc. And kind of, I know you've done podcasts in the past. You have a newsletter, but you see a lot of people around you now starting Substack publication and trying to keep that afloat while balancing other things. So, is the creator a lone kind of wolf now who's kind of got to fend for himself? Is that how a lot of people see it?
Increasingly, I think it's true in the sense, I'm sort of lucky in the sense that I still have ties to institutions, and obviously extremely good, robust institutions. And so I am not at the stage where I'm kind of writing only for my Substack and trying to monetize that, or doing only a podcast and trying to monetize that. But I think this goes back to our earlier question of how business models have changed and how, as news organizations have sometimes been unable to keep people on their roles or to fund their writing in ways that are needed. Obviously, writers think that they would do better by breaking away from the institution and being solo, like you said. And then that becomes this situation where you are your own brand and you have to simultaneously not only do the content, but do the brand promotion. This has been true for book writers for a long time now. It's much less common it's only starting to become a little bit more common for journalists who, magazine and newspaper writers. So I don't know what to think of this. It's still so new that I haven't yet seen how this will shake out. On the one hand, I feel somehow regretful about the fact that journalists have to go out and do this. Most journalists, and I include myself in this, are only really good at what they do. And they should really only be good at what they do. It's hard enough to go out and do reporting and come back and write a decent piece. It's not easy. And really, you should not put these demands on them to sort of also amp up their own marketing and things like that. So I feel bad about that. I feel bad also because the quality of the work suffers. We talked about how if you're a writer in an ecosystem, in an editorial ecosystem, the final product is much better without comparison. It is better to have two editors look at your work. It is better to have multiple fact checkers. It is better to be able to talk about all of this. And if you're just putting work out on a Substack, however good a writer or journalist you are, the work is not as good as it could be. And so I think that is also a drawback of this. And also I feel like this is sort of classic 21st century capitalism, where you shred the institutions of their resources and then insist that the people go out there and turn into marvels of capitalism themselves, turn themselves into entrepreneurs and industries of one, and somehow promote that as a win-win for everybody, for the reader and the institution and the writer. Whereas, even if 10 journalists went out there and you wanted to subscribe to all of their Substacks and you paid $25 a year each, that's $250 a year, which is much less than a newspaper subscription costs on a yearly basis for the work of a lot more people doing much better caliber work. So, I mean, this is some kind of complete, it feels like we're all being fooled by the platforms and the people who promote these platforms. On the other hand, I feel like, if journalism itself is being gutted in fundamental ways financially, it's better than nothing that journalists, people like me, can potentially go out there and try to monetize this for themselves. It's better than not doing any journalism at all. And so, and maybe there is something to be said for the fact that if you are a brand, you will cultivate a particular set of readers who will follow you through your work. And so you can kind of speak to them in a kind intimate kind of relationship that perhaps you could not do from within an institution. So, as I said, I'm undecided, partly because all of this is not yet shaken out in a way that we know for sure what the drawbacks and advantages are. But all said and done, the number of people who will be able to make a living off monetizing their own brand as journalists is going to be minimal. I think, it's going to be the tip of the iceberg and nobody else. The people who have left magazines and newspapers to start their own Substacks and make money off it and are doing well off it are people who would always have done well off it. It's not like the Substack has helped them. And for the remainder, you will have a few thousand subscribers and maybe a few hundred paid subscribers, and you will struggle to get by, and you will wish you had a job in a newsroom. I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work. There will be a long, long tail of people who are out of work and trying to make sure that they can make ends meet with a Substack. And that's not a good look for journalism at all.
Yeah, incidentally, these kinds of dilemmas are also playing out within corporate kinds of entities that we often encounter, because you sometimes get into the stage of divided loyalties, right? You have a loyalty to yourself as a brand because you want to kind of keep that one kind of avenue open if something happens to the industry you are in, the company that you are in. And I think some of these are also these are common concerns across a broad range of people. So right. I actually wanted to ask, because if you look at your current, what it says about your current profile, you're writing about the future of capitalism. So that's a fairly ambitious thing to be kind of commenting on while living through those rapid changes as well as individuals, as commentators. So what is the future of capitalism according to you? Do you have a stance on it? Do you have a particular lens guiding you in the kind of articles that you're doing? Or are you still in the state of an observer who's trying to make sense of it all?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think the future of capitalism is just it's a catchy title. It is essentially a remit for me to go out and see how the world works with some kind of economic perspective. So how markets work, how governments work, how governments relate to their citizens, what happens to resources, it's kind of like a manual to look at, to then go and look at different things in different subject areas. So you can find this future of capitalism in the movie industry and how that works. You can find it in, as I've been doing, in vaccination programs. You can find it, of course, in markets and central bank actions and, theories of economics. So the future of capitalism is everywhere. We're living through it, and it is affecting us throughout. And so I liked this brief because it allowed me to do what I always do, which is wander around the map and just look at what interests me, and except to do it with a particular kind of lens or, viewfinder in my hand. And the idea is not to be prescriptive. I don't think I have huge, I don't think I'm a huge economic ideologue one way or another. Obviously I abhor the depredations of, 21st century capitalism, and many of which have unfolded, in our lifetimes. So it's been very instructional to see some of these play out in real time. But I'm interested. So I'm interested not in sort of just tearing this down wholesale, because that would be quite boring, but just in kind of analyzing and kind of finding interesting and unusual ways in which these things work, that maybe shouldn't be working the way they do. So, I mean, there's one example I can share with you of a story that is going to be published today, I think, which is about, it goes back to my year-long obsession with vaccines, and is about trying to quantify the amount of public funding that has gone into, one or other of these vaccines over the years. I don't mean over the last year, because obviously so much public funding has gone into scaling up manufacturing and, adding capacity at some of these vaccine manufacturers' plants and so on. But I mean the big scientific breakthroughs that over the years made these vaccines possible. Are we able to quantify how much of that was funded by the state, by taxpayers? And it turns out some academics have been trying to do this, and the answer, not surprisingly from people who know drug development, is there's a huge amount of, in the case of one vaccine, between 97.1 and 99% of all research funding came from public institutions or philanthropies. What happens to that money now? Well, that money has then been transformed into an IP that the company owns. Some companies are choosing not to profit off the vaccine as long as the pandemic lasts, which they have described arbitrarily until July 2021. After that, they can price the vaccine at any point. Other companies are profiting from day one, Pfizer and Moderna and so on. And the governments, having funded all of this research in the past, are now spending more money to buy those vaccines back at, $20 a dose or whatever, to administer to their own taxpayers. So the taxpayers paying again and again for the vaccines and how they've come into this world. So now this is an interesting example because, while we always knew this conceptually, that this is how drug development works, the coronavirus pandemic, the transparency and the urgency of it has provided a unique window to analyzing some of this data and to analyzing some of these processes. And it is an indirect, it's a direct link to how capitalism works, in a sense. It's a direct link to the power of the private sector and of corporations, to the stickiness of a particular kind of model that we just think that, well, this is just how, things work, the stickiness of certain, what do we call it, cliches of thought, so for example, if companies aren't allowed to enforce patents and licenses, then there will be no incentive to conduct R&D and discover new drugs. Well, as we find out from this vaccine process, these companies didn't do most of the research in the first place. They didn't have the incentive to do a lot of this until it was brought much closer to market. The incentive was all in universities and public institutes, and the incentive was all, and the funding was all being driven by grant money from some of these governments. And so, it is useful to re-examine some of these principles of economic philosophy that we tend to take for granted. So this is an example of the kind of thing that I want to do with this future of capitalism, is to not just look at interest rate cuts and things like that, because I think that's quite dull, but to examine some of these larger issues.
Making the dismal science a little more interesting.
Yeah, or
Perhaps.
avoiding the dismal science altogether as much as possible.
So, one final question there is that whenever you let me take an example. You wrote an article about NFTs a short
Yeah.
while ago, and you guys also had a nice little gimmick around it and so on. If I were to call it that,
It is absolutely.
so, tell me a little bit about the research process. In the sense that I'm just curious to know. It's like getting into a rabbit hole and not kind of exiting, staying there for a while, looking around the place, and then coming out with some coherence. I think emerging with that is important. Otherwise, you can just do this forever like a doctoral student. So I know you don't have that luxury. So what I'm curious about is, let's say you look back something like an NFT or even the vaccine development thing. How would you get started? What is your map going to be look like? And when do you stop? When do you say I have enough? Is it the deadline that drives it, or is it just that I think I now have a coherent view of this topic?
So the map, things usually start with reading, as they often do. So you try to read enough to understand things in your own mind, and to isolate what you think the interesting unanswered questions and the interesting themes are. This goes back to our earlier topic of, there may be a superficial narrative in a lot of pieces, but what is really interesting and makes these stories, last longer than a day is the sense you can prevail of some kind of more durable, longer lasting, more universal themes and ideas. And this, of course, it's particularly true of long form pieces, less so of the NFT piece, I think, but let's take that as a. So you do enough reading to identify these questions, then you start talking to people. And the most fundamental unit of journalism is conversation. However much you read, I think there is no substitute for being able to ask people questions and have them tell you things. So it invariably involves then starting to make calls, video calls now, phone calls and meetings in an earlier era. And once you've done enough of that, I think, of course, the deadline pressure is ever present, less so for longer pieces, but more so for short pieces. But I think more than anything else, I think you stop doing research when you think that you have isolated something in your mind that you have not seen out there yet in the coverage of a topic, or some kind of deeper, more fundamental question that people have missed. Or you think that you have an interesting answer to a question that is being posed by other people, or that you have sometimes even just sort of, the questions may be the same and the answers may broadly be the same, but the way you are telling the story is utterly different and new and compelling. And so you have that, and then you return to the world and start writing. So it's knowing when to stop research is often a function of knowing when you think you have enough to interest a reader, and that depends a lot on how long the piece is going to be, how deep it is going to go. A lot of these quite functional elements of journalism start playing a role. But it's very easy the reason I like doing books is because it indulges me. It gives me the chance to do this rabbit hole thing for 4 years on average. I don't have to emerge until I'm quite ready. I can take my time. I can kind of keep revisiting things. I can. It's my one chance to go into the kind of depth that a beat reporter would otherwise have in their own day-to-day careers. Somebody who has covered the finance industry for 10 years will have the kind of enviable depth and breadth of contacts and knowledge and so on that I wish I had about a lot of things, and I don't. But the books give me a chance to simulate some of that for myself.
And are you the organized note taker types who has tries tools one after the other, got Rome and Notion, or how do you go about organizing all these material that you encounter?
So Okay. So for journalism, I'm very organized. It's that there is a process. I take notes. I take, if I'm meeting somebody in person, I do taped interviews and I transcribe those interviews. I organize my research. So for work, I'm quite regimented and can usually sort of find material quite easily. What I had found for a long time, and this might be interesting to talk about, but like it is in the non-work sections of my life, and not just reading, but like, any kind of experience, whether it was going to a museum or whatever, where I found that I was being less regimented than I would like, in the sense that I would read things or experience things and later want to remember them and find that I had a poorer memory than I would like to have for some aspects of that. And I don't mean details. Like I don't mean like a quote in a book. That's not the point. My memory was poorer, I noticed, for some of the larger ideas. Like the things would strike me, but then I would, they would all kind of mix together a few years later, and I would regret not having taken notes then. And so last year, I decided I would, as everybody seems to be doing right now, try a note-taking app. So I use Bear, which is an iOS app. I don't use it for every book, so it's not like I'm annotating, like the Gideon Hay book that I'm reading now, for example. It's not like I'm taking notes from there, although I might. It's an excellent book, but definitely books that I consider that I'm doing as serious reading that I want, either for a project or for just sort of to educate myself better in something. I have started taking notes. And I haven't yet felt the fruits of that. Like it's been so recent that I still remember the books I read quite well. I think it's only a couple of years down the line when I want to refer back to these notes that I will see how effective they are. But by and large, I felt that this had to do with a larger lack I felt in my life of sort of structured non-work reading or structured non-work. I mean, I do a lot of unstructured reading, too unstructured for my own good. So I wanted some kind of systematization in just to kind of get more out of the experience. It sounds like a very Stakhanovite way to approach reading, which should be fun and interesting. And it is still fun and interesting, but I felt like, sort of having small projects for myself or having these kind of small notes taken on the side and so on would just make me better as a reader and a writer. And so I've started to do that.
Yeah, it's almost like, people who do, I mean, we do get sometimes asked about how do you become a quizzer, right? How do you get good at quizzing? And you kind of struggle to answer that question because there is no one thing. It is just a system or an environment that you kind of find yourself in. And I mean, just to kind of, I think some people listening to this will kill me if I don't bring up a little bit of quizzing in this conversation. Is that, what I realized over the years was that how much of quizzing was not so much about the questions, but it was about the social aspect of quizzing. It was about hanging out with certain kinds of people who had interesting things, or it was always, we had a social recommendation engine long before there were apps to do that. So it is that, that osmosis, being inside that environment, that played the highest role. And therefore you didn't need to go out and systematically remember stuff unless it was for writing a question for an upcoming quiz, in which case you just had to get stuff down somewhere. So, anything on the social side of quizzing? Because I don't think too many people talk about the fact that, so when people say that, why aren't people getting into quizzing? I think you just, it's partly the groups that hook you in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think like even now, 25 years after I started quizzing, 25 years after my first landmark quiz in Madras, I mean, especially now, I think like most of my best friends are quizzers. People I text on a daily basis are quizzers. My most active WhatsApp groups are all comprised of quizzers. And it's not like we're talking about quizzing, but the advantage, in fact, we almost never talk about quizzing, but the distinct advantage is that these are people with quite a wide range of interests and a huge curiosity to just know things from different fields. Each one has their own specializations and deep fields of knowledge, and it's amazing to be able to ask them questions, and they will be able to tell you things, not quiz questions, but just things that you want to know. So I think it's and the social aspect of it is perhaps the main reason why I do it, I think, and why, when it's something that I've missed so much over the last year and a half because of the pandemic, and then quizzing is just essentially ground to a halt. But and the social recommendation engine is something that's extremely useful. I mean, there are so many things I have discovered for myself based on the recommendations of these people. Partly because now we know each other's tastes, and so we will tell each other what we think they will like. But also, just out of conversations, interesting ideas will emerge. Schools of small subgenres of cinema or books or what have you, things that I've ignored or have not even known the existence of, I will sort of pursue and kind of grow to fall in love with myself. I mean, so really a way to enlarge your world. And so you're right in the sense that you would in an earlier era, you would need to know just enough to frame a question, and that's pretty much it. And even the kind of, I mean, just to go back to the previous subject, I mean, even the kind of attention I pay now to some of the things that the notes that I make, for example, would be very different from the notes that I make if I find an interesting quiz question in a book. The quiz question notes are sort of what people will call fundas. It's like a little piece of trivia or a little, sort of passing coincidence that makes it a nice question or whatever. But the notes I make for myself outside of that are much more abstract and much more idea based. And this is partly a result of maybe our collective education in India, where we only ever learn to read for the facts, and we never learn to read for underlying themes and arguments. And so it's something that I've had to really, even today, I have to keep paying attention to what is the underlying argument in a piece of text. Can I, because very often it doesn't have to be stated explicitly, but it's still there. And I need to be able to draw that out for myself and to then put that away in notes somewhere to be able to remember what a book was truly about, which is not the surface narrative, but the arguments below.
Right. So, Samanth, I have about 8 minutes left on the clock. So I will ask my last quiz question before
Sure.
starting to wrap up. So what I'm talking about originates from something called the OOPH, okay, OOPH, a Phoenician word for a monkey. And it has also, the shape of what I'm talking about is supposed to resemble a monkey and its tail. The origins have also been attributed to the eye of a needle or a knot of a rope. So what am I talking about? The answer is a single letter.
Is this Aleph or A, essentially the first letter of the alphabet?
You're close, but that's not the right answer.
Okay.
Think again, it's connected to you. So.
Oh yes, okay.
Or something we just alluded to. So monkey's tail, eye of a needle, knot of a rope are some explanations for why this shape comes about.
Alpha? The Greek letter?
No.
Okay.
Stick with, I mean, it's a letter. So.
It's a letter.
It's a letter.
This is the question I'm going to flub, I'm sure. Is it Q? Q for quizzing?
It is Q. It is Q. So that's one of the explanations for Q.
Interesting. And, okay.
Yeah. So I think what happens is that, because you have to come up with a question, you kind of go and dig, and that has its own, benefits. Yeah. So
amazing, because OOF sounds so much like alpha. I mean, it sounds like that there is a.
Yeah. It does. Yeah. It's a bit of a kind of sets you on the wrong track.
Yeah. Nice.
That's useful as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Okay. So let's kind of bring this conversation to a close. I just want to get some quick takes from you on a few of the topics. I'll start with something called as the future relevance of X. I'm going to give you 3 topics, and just off the top of your head, how do you see the future of these? One is the future relevance of the New Yorker.
The magazine itself may or may not exist. Who knows? I hope it does. But the kind of work that it does and the by and large sort of strict adherence to fact and fact checking, the rigor, I think all of that will be even more relevant in days to come. I mean, in a time when you can't trust what you see online or what you get forwarded on WhatsApp, there is increasing relevance for an institution that you can take at face value and trust to tell the truth, and to present things in context. And so immense, I would say.
Okay. In fact, I think the last few years have kind of made us more aware of what a fact really is. I think we've experienced our share of kitchen questions, as they call in the circuit, which is cooked up questions, and we've had our brush with a lot of cool but not true facts. So I think hopefully, that's a good point. The future relevance of the Kindle.
Again, similar in a sense that I assume now, electronic books are not going to go away. The Kindle may not exist. Hopefully, we'll have something that looks better and does a better job of representing books without killing your eyes. Hopefully, we will have, a company or an ecosystem that is not controlled by just one company. Always good. But again, the future relevance of the Kindle is tied to the future relevance of the book. The book itself is immortal. I think that is never going to go away. In fact, the thing I've been surprised by is the continuing relevance of the print book. Surprised and pleased by it. I don't deny using the Kindle. I use it a lot, particularly when I have to get books quickly for work. I tend to download and consult them. But, I have just moved from just yesterday, a Kindle book. I finished one book and then I started another one, and the second one was in print, and immediately I felt, sort of a vast relief at being able to take in words from a page.
Yeah, it enables to do things like these, which is to point to the author's book and not
Correct.
point to the Kindle with somewhere
which is ultra dull, and you can't see what anybody is reading on the train, which is always a pain.
Correct. No, but do you think the Kindle has actually been around for a while? So are you surprised by how little innovation has happened, in a sense, since the Kindle in the world of books?
I actually think its success is due to the lack of innovation. I think the success is due to the fact that it was simple to start with. It tried as closely as possible within the limits of what an electronic device can do to mimic what a book does. No frills, similar kinds of motor functions to turn pages and so on, and not do anything else, not build a browser in there that you can then check Twitter on, all of these other rabbit holes. And I think a large part of its success lies in the fact that it has stayed quite constant. They launched a Kindle Fire, for example, as you may remember. And, there's no comparison. I mean, I would never read a book on a Fire or even on an iPad anymore, I think. So it's a tribute to it's a testament to the power of the printed book, that the electronic device that most successfully aims to replace it has to mimic it so closely.
Okay, the future relevance of long form writing.
Again, immense. For similar reasons to the future relevance of the New Yorker being immense. I think there will be more, not less, need for depth and complexity and nuance. There will be more, not less, need for rigor and fact-checking. And there will be, the world is complicated, and it will only grow more complex. It's kind of like a ramifying entity. And so I think you will need more and more long-form journalism. Whether you will see more and more of it, if the economics of it allow it, that's a different question altogether. But it will still be relevant. I mean, the people who continue to do it will, I think, always find readers, and it'll be invaluable work. So many of the big things that we have seen develop over the last few years have been the result of just nose to the ground long form journalism. I mean, just off the top of my head, the series of public figures who were and Hollywood celebrities who were toppled by the Me Too scandal. It was all the result of work done over months, sometimes years, by journalists who had the time and patience to do it. So incredibly relevant, I would say.
Okay. Some of the people listening to us today are interested in things like writing. So, but they're not going to be professional writers, but they see the value of writing in what they do. Can you recommend a couple of great books, timeless books that they think they should read and reread so that they get better at writing?
The trick the trick is not to read books on writing, I think. Books that tell you how to write are invariably flat and kind of not particularly engaging, and they're only really interesting to people who have spent years in it already and want to kind of just understand the nuts and bolts inside out. The trick is to read books that make you want to write more. The trick is to read books that excite your sense of what language can do or what communication can do. And that is different for different people. One of the authors, writers I keep coming back to time and time again, even now, of course, after decades, is P.G. Wodehouse, because I think like reading a few pages of Wodehouse, renews my enthusiasm for the language, the musicality of it, the potential of it, the color in it. And so, that is my trick. People will have different tricks. I mean, so depending on what you want to achieve with your writing, I think you should set out to read writing that does that kind of thing well. So, for example, if you want to be a science communicator, as we talked about, read a lot of Haldane. Haldane's essays are available online, very easy to digest. And if you are looking for a good model for yourself, there's no one better. If you want to, trying to think now, if you want to write about food, you should read A.J. Liebling. If you want to write about or communicate things about technology, for example, if you're a tech writer or you're in the tech space, it's useful to read a magazine like Wired, because you often, Wired's articles put a human face on technology. They don't treat technology as some kind of abstract black box where things happen, but they kind of show it as a product of human processes and human intervention, and with decidedly human effects. So, the answer is to read not books about writing, but books that have good writing, or articles that exhibit good writing, and learn from there.
Are journalists in any way worried about AI-generated tools like GPT-3? Do you see it as the Terminator, or do you not lose any sleep?
Unless AI can go out and interview people and come back and describe what a factory looks like, and the conversations that it had, and what it felt while it was doing these interviews, no, I'm not worried.
All right. And my last question is that one of your pieces I read a quote by Haldane's sister, which is talking about Haldane saying that he thinks things are going to be much worse before they are better. Do you share that sentiment, or is your glass differently filled?
Much worse than they are now. I don't know. I have different answers on different days. There are some days on which I read, just because of my own interest in it, I end up reading a lot about what people in the climate change industry say about the next 50 years. And on those days, a lot of things seem truly irreversible, and so I think I think, as Naomi said, that they will be a lot worse before they're a lot better, if at all they become a lot better. I see the human tendency to cut corners and to profiteer and to oppress, and I think these tendencies won't go away. And as the world gets harsher in a warming climate, they will only be exacerbated. And in which case, then we are looking at a very bleak time indeed. But within our own lifetimes, I feel enough will stay the same that we can have good lives and live responsible lives still, but still not feel the worst effects of all of this. I mean, the things I worry about most, the times I worry about most of the times after us. But having said that, we've survived this far, and there are enough good people out there, clearly, because these are the people writing about the climate change problems and these other problems that I'm talking about. And so, maybe it just needs a fundamental shift in the system that allows those kind of energies to dominate. And it's tied very much to the beat that I'm on now. This Future of Capitalism beat is very much about what that system will look like in a way that enables us to avoid some of these pitfalls and these catastrophes to come.
Right. On that sobering note, Samanth, here's wishing you more stories, more conversations, and hopefully more interesting little rabbit holes for you to explore. Thank you so much for being on the CTQ Smartcast.
Thanks so much, Ramanand. It was amazing. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.